Welcome everybody. Today we are going to be working on project number 1. The whole purpose of this project is to give everybody a chance to use some basic tools in the shop, to use basic fasteners, and just practice common construction techniques. If you can master this box, you can build probably 95% of anything that you're going to run into in the theater construction world. By mastering these tools, you can build platforms, you can build flats, you can build staircases. It's just a matter of being able to make these cuts correctly and fasten everything together flush and true. So everyone's going to start with this sheet of paper. This is the assignment paper. You'll have this when you come in to do your assignment. You will also be given one 16-inch piece of 1x6, one 16-inch piece of 2x4, and one 8x8 piece of Luan. To build this project, you are going to have to do a couple things. You're going to have to cut down your 1x6 into 1x4s, so it's the same size as your 2x4. And you're also going to have to use the miter saw to cut everything to length. This is a pretty basic project with pretty basic steps, so I'm just going to take you through the process of how to do that. First thing that you need to do is determine what length you need to cut everything down to. So as you can see up in the corner here, I have provided a cut list for both 1x4 and 2x4. The 1x6 is going to have to get turned into a 1x4 at some point. You can do that, you should do that on the table saw, either before or after the crosscuts. Depending on what you're building, depends kind of when you want to do your ripping. In this situation, it doesn't matter if you want to do your crosscuts first, do your crosscuts, or if you want to do your rips first, do your rips first. The steps that I'm going to take is I'm going to go ahead and do all of my crosscuts and then go over to the table saw and do my ripping. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first step in building this box is going to be determining how long you need to cut each piece. As I said just earlier, I've already provided you the cut list. So you can see that there's a 1x4 and a 2x4 cut list. Let's go ahead and start with the 1x4 cut list because that's right above right now, or that's the first one on the list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my 1x6, and as I said, I could either rip this down to 3.5 inches right away, or I can cut my 2 pieces on the miter saw and then go rip it down. So what I'm choosing to do is to do both of my cross cuts first, and then I'm going to go rip it down. When you're doing your cuts, you always want to cut your longest pieces first and then your shorter pieces. So the first piece that I'm going to cut, it says right here, it might be hard to see, but it's 8 inches. I want one at 8 inches. So I'm going to take my tape measure, hook it right on the edge of the board so that I'm following the edge, and I can go at this edge or I can go at the top edge. If I go in the middle, I might have my tape measure not square and it might swing and I might not get a super exact measurement. So I'm going to line it up right to the edge and I'm going to make a mark right at 8 inches. Now I can do it one of 2 ways. I can either do a little tick, just a nice little tick like that, or I could do what's called a crow's foot. And the crow's foot, I'm going to start right at 8 inches and pull this way, and then I'm going to start right at 8 inches again and pull right there. The little tick is really nice because it's pretty accurate. The crow's foot is nice because it's easy to see. Either way, I have my 8-inch piece right here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my speed square, putting my pencil right on my mark, and slide my speed square up to it and mark all the way across. So now I've got one consistent line for the whole 8 inches. And then I'm going to put an X for my offcut. Remember, we need to think about our offcut because of kerf. Kerf is the thickness of the blade. So as I cut this material, I'm actually going to be removing an 1/8 inch of wood. So if I put my blade on the wrong side of this line, I might end up having something that is 7 7/8 inches instead of 8 inches. So I'm going to make my line and then make my X. Now, I can go to the miter saw and make this cut and then come back and do the exact same process. Or if I want to measure all of my pieces out first, I can come from the other side and I can measure my second cut on my cut list, which is 7¼ inches. And I'm gonna do that just because I wanna save the steps. So starting right on the edge, I'm gonna make a mark right at 7¼ inches. Then repeat with the speed square. Just slide that right in. And I've got my X. So now this is my offcut for both. So I'm gonna put the saw blade on this side of the line for my 8-inch piece. I'm gonna put the saw blade on this side of the line for my 7¼ inch piece. Just so I don't get confused, I'm also gonna write 7¼ and 8 inches. So that way in the future, when it's time to assemble this, I don't have to keep pulling my tape measure out to figure out what piece is what. So now I could go over to the miter saw and cut these, but before I do that, I might as well do my 2x4 as well. So same process. I'm gonna look at my cut list, and as you can see with my 2x4 cut list, I need one at 7¼ and one at 5¾ So I'm just gonna do the exact same thing. I'm gonna take from one side, starting right so that I'm perpendicular or parallel with the end. I'm gonna make one mark at 7¼ and then strike my square line and write 7¼ and then I'm gonna come from this side and I'm gonna do 5, straight to the edge, 5¾ And now I know that this is my offcut for both sides as well. So now what I'm ready to do is go over to the miter saw to make my cuts. You might want to double check your lines just in case these are off, because you only get the one piece of wood for this assignment. So I'm gonna check again, and I'm confirming that that is 7¼ on the line, and this is 5¾ right on the line. And I can even come back here. That is 8 inches, and that is 7¼ spot on. So let's go over to the miter saw and make our cuts. Okay, now that we're over at the miter saw, I want to show you with a really up-close view on how to line up your cuts. And then I'll zoom out and kind of show you guys the rest of these cuts. But it's really important, as I said before, but to think about the kerf. Now the kerf is the thickness of the blade. So you can see as I come in here, there's actually the thickness of the blade, and you can actually see the indentation right here. So that's how much the blade is going to remove. You always want to make sure that your blade is sitting on the side with your X or your offcut side. So as I come in here, what I'm going to do to get the most accurate cut is I'm actually going to slide my material towards the blade or away from the blade until the tip of one of my saw teeth is just touching the line. And as you can see, there's a slight gap right now between the tooth and the line. So what I want to do is just ever so closely inch until the tooth is actually touching the line of the 1x6 or whatever material I'm cutting. What's nice about this saw is that it's a sliding miter saw, so you can actually move and rotate it to make sure that a tooth is touching the line where you want it. Once you're sure you've got your material where you want it, make sure you've got it firmly held, and then you're just going to lift the saw blade off of the material and make your cut. All right, now that I've got my first cut done, what I can do is I'm going to take it and I'm just going to double check one more time to make sure that it's exactly 7¼ inches. Now that it is, I'm going to set this one off to the side and go make my next cut. Now, because the miter saw works so much better for right-handed people, or at least to use right-handed because of the motor and everything else, instead of trying to do this and shifting my body all the way over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take this board, and as you can see the line, I'm just going to take it and flip it. So that way I'm still on the correct side of the miter saw so everything's getting cut and it's a lot more comfortable. Now all I'm going to do is finish up my cuts. So I'll take this guy, I'll line him up, get it right where I want. And remember, when you're using this saw, you want to be pushing towards the fence and down to keep it from moving. So I'm going to hold this in place with my left hand. I'm going to take my right hand without touching the trigger, keep my fingers loose, and I'm going to line it up right onto my mark. When I get it where I want it, I'm going to lift the blade up a little bit. I don't have to go all the way up. If you're more comfortable doing that, you can. But all I'm going to do is get it where I want it, pick it so that the blade isn't touching the material, and start it. And I'm going to go down and in. When I'm done with that, I've got my little scrap piece that I can throw away in our trash can. And then I'm going to check my measurement one more time, and that is exactly 8 inches. So it's right where I want it. Put that over in my done pile, and now I'm going to take my 2x4 that is also already marked, and I'm going to just repeat the process. So I'll start with this line here, get it where I want it, check my length, 5 3/4, that's exactly right. Then I'm going to take this and I'm going to flip it so that I can still stay on this side of the saw. Line it up. Check my length, 7 1/4, that's right where I want it. Take my trash, throw it away. So now I have all of my 2x4 done, and I've got 1x6 still that needs to turn into 1x4. So for that, we head over to the table saw. All right, so now we're over at the table saw. And to get the table saw set correctly, basically all we need to do is adjust our fence to our blade. Before we can do that though, we need to make sure that our blade is set to the right height. As you can see right now, this blade is shorter than the actual material we're going through. When you're trying to rip something, you always want anywhere from about 1/4 to 1/2 inch of the blade sticking up past the material. So all I'm going to do is just raise the blade, and now you can see how it's just slightly raised above. I might turn it just a little bit more. Now my blade is where I want it to be. Now it's time to turn my 1x6 into a 1x3, or I'm sorry, a 1x4 for this project. So what I'm going to do, oftentimes you're going to find that there's a ruler on your table saw. This ruler is so worn out that you can't even read it, which is okay because I've never really trusted them anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my tape measure, and I'm going to measure the distance between the fence and the blade, and I'm going to do the exact same thing that I was doing on the miter saw, where I was thinking about where's my offcut and where's all of that going to end up going. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to slide it until my tape measure is directly under 3 1/2 inches on the tooth. Now that might be kind of hard to see, but this space between the inside of the blade and the fence is exactly 3 1/2 inches. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to lock it in place and make sure that it doesn't move. If it does, which it did just a little bit, I'm going to unlock back here, and then at the base, I'm going to knock it in whichever direction it needs to go. So I just need to knock it about 1/16 of an inch out. And now it is exactly 3 1/2 inches. So that means that I'm ready to make my cuts. One last thing to think about is when you're using your table saw, you need to look for like cupping and bowing and anything like that. So if you see this 1x6, it's kind of rocking. If I'm going to use this on the table saw, I always want it to be frowning and not smiling. So right now you can see that it's kind of smiling, right? If you flip it, now it's frowning. But what that does is it gets that rock taken out. If I flip it up like this as I'm cutting it, it can actually rock as I'm cutting it, and it'll mess your cut up a little bit. So always take the time to check and make sure that it's not smiling, it's frowning. So now when it's time to make my cut, okay, now that I've got my fence set up to exactly 3.5 inches, like how I want it to make my 1x4 or my 1x6 into a 1x4, all I need to do now is cut it. Now remember, the table saw is really dangerous if you use it incorrectly. So I want to make sure that I've got everything ready before I get started. So the first thing that I'm going to do is make sure that I've got my push stick where I can reach it, right there, and then I've got all of my material handy and I know which way is smiling and which way is frowning. So I'm going to start with this piece and then I'm going to just grab this piece as I go. Now you don't have to turn the saw off in between every single cut. All you need to do is do your cut, make sure that you clear it without leaning over the blade, and then move on to your next cut. Always try to practice turning the saw off with your hip because this is a hip switch and it makes things just a lot safer. If something binds, you get that muscle memory for shutting it off. So let's go ahead and turn it on. Now that the saw is running, I'm going to take my piece of material, keep it flat against the fence. As I'm pushing, I'm looking at the fence, not at the blade. As I feed it, I want to feed it straight through. So I'm going to start with the material completely on the table saw top, and then I'm just going to hook it and then just push it straight through at a nice, consistent pace. Once I get to this point, instead of pushing it past the blade, all I'm going to do is rotate my wrist and flick the piece of wood out of the way. Okay? You can see now it's cleared and it's not going to get bound up in the blade. I can clear it a little more if I want, but I don't necessarily need to worry about it. Then I'm going to take my next piece and do the exact same thing. I'm going to set my push stick down, get this set so I know exactly where it is, and then I'm just going to push this and clear it, and then turn my saw off. I'm going to wait until the saw blade completely stops spinning. Now that it's not spinning anymore, I'm going to take my 2 off-cut pieces and throw those away in the garbage because I don't need those anymore. That's all the more there is to using the table saw for this project. All you need to remember is just nice, easy passes. If you wanted to do this step before doing your cross-cutting, that's totally okay. And for this project, it doesn't matter. It's 6 one way, half a dozen the other. So feel free to come over here and rip a 16-inch board or an 8-inch and a 7 1/4 inch. It's really up to you. That one's your choice. All right, so now we've got all of our pieces cut. We can come back to our drawing because we know that we've got the cut list complete. So now it's just a matter of putting it all together. Now, if you notice, there are 2 joints that need to be stapled and 2 joints that need to be screwed together. Those are the 2 most common ways that we fasten materials together, especially wood, when we're in the scene shop. So I think we're going to start by screwing things together because you'll find that stapling is a lot easier. So I like to just do the hard part first and get it out of the way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just have my drawing in front of me and I'm going to look and say, okay, it looks like my box is going to end up looking something kind of like this. Looking at the drawing, that's how the joints line up, and it does kind of look like a box. I don't know if you guys can see that at that angle, but so now looking at the drawing, I say, okay, I need to screw this joint and I need to screw this joint. So I'm just going to start with this, and I'm going to pull those 2 away. I'm going to start screwing this together. So the first thing that I need to do is take my screw gun and I'm going to do my pilot holes. I've got an 1/8 inch or slightly smaller pre-drill bit to get my pilot holes started and so that my wood doesn't split out. So I'm going to start by just holding it upright like this so that I've got more control. Then I'm going to hold it as flush as possible. We remember flush, where both of these surfaces I can run my finger over it and there's no, I can't feel anything. I can't feel one over the other. It's just one smooth plane. So I get this to where I like it. That feels pretty good. And then I'm just going to make sure that my drill is in 2, and I'm going to put in my 2 pilot holes. In and out, never taking it out of forward. Okay, and now I've got my 2 pilot holes started. Now, what you can do is have a second drill with your bit already in it. I don't have two drills with me right now, so what I have to do is set this down. You want to try not to do that, but sometimes it happens. So I'm going to set that down. I'm going to switch into just my driver. So I'm going to put that in, and I'm going to switch into 1, because 1 gives me more control and more torque. And when you're driving screws, especially 3-inch screws, you want that control and torque. So now I need to take, and even though I've got it all pre-drilled, I need to make sure that everything is back to where I want it to be. So I get this flushed up not only on this face, but on the face that I'm going to be attaching my Luan to as well. So I'm feeling both sides as I'm doing this, and I'm making sure that everything is nice and flush. Once I get it where I want it, I'm going to take a screw and stick it in one of my pre-drilled holes. Okay? And then I'm just going to start slow, and as it starts going in, I'm just going to drive my screw. I'm going to drive my screw until it's just flush to the top. And now, if I'm slightly off, I can adjust this to make sure that everything is still nice and flush. But it feels like I did a pretty good job. So now I'm just going to take another 3-inch screw. And same thing. I'll get it started, make sure that everything's still where I want it, and then I'm just going to slowly drive it in. Okay? Use the variable speed trigger. When you're driving screws, you don't want to go 0 to 100 right off the bat. You really want to take your time, get a slow start, make sure that you're seated really well, and then get going. Okay? So now I've got that joint done. I'm going to go back to my drawing and say, okay, I need this piece, and I'm going to dry fit everything together again to make sure, or because I've got it labeled 8 inches and my drawing says this is the 8-inch piece, I can just put that piece in without dry fit. So now it's time to put a screw in here. So I'm going to go back to my pre-drill, switch back into number 2, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this so that it's nice and flush. Then I'm going to put in my 2 pre-drills. Change back to this. And you can see where having 2 drills is a real advantage, because then you're not starting and stopping and starting and stopping. So now I need to grab my screws, grab the correct screws. Remember, if you can't remember what length you're supposed to be using, the number 1 rule is always 2 times the thickness of the material you're going through. So for 3/4 inch material, you want 1 5/8 or 1 1/2 screws. If I were to try to use these 3-inch screws, you can see how much longer that is, and that's just a comical amount of screw that you don't need. All you need are these. So then I'm going to take my 2 screws, I'll put one in my first hole to get it started, and then I'm going to check and make sure that everything is nice and flush again, right where I want it, and then same thing. Okay, I'll drive that, make sure that it's nice and flush, make sure that nothing else moved around. That feels flush, kind of rotate it a little bit, and now that feels flush. So then I'll shoot in my second screw. Okay, and now everything, let's just say I actually got slightly off. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it kind of walked a little bit. So what I'm going to do, I knew it was right before, so I'm going to take this screw out, and I'm going to, oops, wrong screw. I'm going to take this screw that I just drove out, and I'm going to reset it to where I want it so that it's all nice and flush. Okay? When I do this, I don't use the same screw hole though, because wood is lazy and it's going to find that micro adjustment and it's just going to suck it right back to where it was. So now that I've got it where I want it, I'm going to put in a new screw hole just to the side of the old one. And now, put back into one. Check that that's where I want it. And now it's nice and flush and it's perfectly flat. I don't know if you can see that or not. But so that's the hard part. Once you get this screwed together, then you get to switch to the staple gun. And everybody loves using staple guns. So what I'm going to do is I now know that the rest of my joints are going to get stapled together according to my drawing. So I'm going to get my staple gun, check that I've got the right length of staples, which in this situation we want 1.5 inches, right? Because 2 times the thickness. Then I'm just going to start, and I'm going to pick one joint, and I'm going to make sure that all of my sides are flush. Run my finger over it, and then once I get it where I want it, I'm going to use my staple gun as kind of a clamp. You can see how this, I can kind of hit it, and it's still holding it in place. But I'm keeping my finger off the trigger because I don't want to shoot myself with the staple gun. So I get all this lined up pretty close to where I want it to be. Then I'm going to start just on this side, and I'm going to check that everything's flush with my thumb. Then I'm going to move my hand. Oop, the whole thing moved. Then I'm going to move my hand to a safe distance and shoot my first staple. Okay? I'm just going to do one for now, because if I try to do all of it, it might shift more. But now I've got this side held, so I'm going to work on the other side. I'll slide this here. That looks good. Check one last time. Finger on the trigger and fire. And then with staples, we always want to do 3 staples. Okay? And you can see how my staples are running into what they're going. You never want your staples running into the wood this way, because if they spread, you might get yourself a pokey ouchie, and then it'll poke you and you'll go ouchie and it won't be any fun. So finally, all we've got left is our last bit right here. This is our last corner to fasten together. So all I'm going to do is same thing. I'm going to kind of push and pull, and if you've cut everything correctly, you should be pretty close to accurate. So I've got everything nice and flush where I want it. And then finger off of the trigger, finger on trigger, check that everything's still good and flush. Keep fighting with my air hose. And fire and fire. So now I've got my box frame. Nothing to it, nice and simple. So now all I need to do is attach the luan. If you guys remember in class, we talked about how all sheet goods have a good side and a bad side. The bad side always has a sticker on it, or the bad side should be the side with the sticker on it. All of your squares, to denote the bad side, I'm going to put a little X on it. So make sure that the X is going on the bad side, which is against the frame. Also, you need glue. When you're putting anything on, staples don't have that much holding power. All of the holding power comes from the mechanical fastening, or I'm sorry, the chemical fastening of the glue, not the staples. The staples, think of them more as like temporary clamps than anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of dry fit this to make sure that everything looks right and everything's pretty square. If it's not 100% square, that's okay. We'll fix it. Then what I'm going to do is check the length of my staples, because these are definitely a lot longer than twice the thickness of this. I'm going to switch to 3/4 inch, And I know you're thinking to yourself, well, 3/4 isn't twice of a quarter. 1/2-inch staples are just a little too short, so this is the one exception. Think of construction in the shop just like the English language. There's exceptions to everything. The one time we go slightly larger is with staples to Luan. It's always 3/4 of an inch. So I'm going to put my 3/4 inch staples into my gun, and then I'm going to check my lid, make sure it's where I want it. Everything looks good. Watch out for splinters. And then you're just going to run some glue on the top of your frame. Now when you put glue down, you don't want to run just a little bead, okay? You can see how I put that down like that. If you do just that, it's not going to hold as well. So once you put your glue down, take your finger and spread it so that it's got more surface area to hold on to. The entire surface should be covered in glue. Do you see how there's more there than on this side? You're just spreading it out. Don't worry about your finger. The glue wipes off pretty easily. So I'm just running my finger, getting the glue to cover the entire surface. If there's a point where you didn't put enough glue on, that's okay. Just go back, put on a little bit more glue. Once you set your glue though, once your glue goes down, you really don't have that much time. So you want to make sure that everything's ready. You don't want to put your glue on and then say, oh shoot, I forgot to cut this piece, or oh, I don't even have my staple gun. You want to have everything ready for it, okay? Now I've got my glue down. My finger's all gluey. I can do two things. I can take a rag and wipe it off, or I can just kind of rub my hands together and the friction will actually dry it. You can see I've got dirty hands right now, but it'll just dry it and peel it right off, and now it's clean, okay? So that's usually what I end up doing. So now when we go to attach our lid, I'm going to put it and I'm going to pick a corner. For this box, it doesn't really matter, but I'm going to pick a corner and I'm going to make this corner the only thing I'm focusing on. And I want it to be perfectly flush on both sides. Once it is, thinking about what I'm shooting into, I'm going to shoot one staple. Then I'm going to work my way down this side of the box, making sure that it's flush all the way. And you can see right now there's a slight little lip. So I'm just going to push it so that it's nice and flush, and then I'm going to shoot the rest of my staples. Really, you only need a staple about every 8 inches, but for this box, we want at least 3. You don't need to go through and go all Wyatt Earp and shoot 30,000 staples, though. That's a little bit overkill. So now you can see there's a slight overhang on this side now, and that's good because we know that the lid is square. We never check the box for square because the lid is going to square it all up for us. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to push the lid and hold it in place until all of this is perfectly flush. Then I'm just going to shoot my staples, thinking about the correct direction, right? Because you still need to be aware of pokey ouchies. And I'm going to go through and shoot my staples. So now at this point, if this side or this side that has them in stapled isn't flush, there's not a lot you can do about it because the whole box has been built. But if you've got 2 corners flush, the whole thing should be flush and square. So I'm just going to continue stapling. And there's my box. And that's all there is to it. My last step that I'm going to do is I'm going to take and write my name right on the top of my box so that I know who built it when it's time to go grade things. And that's it.